All right. Okay. So does somebody want to explain what the game is and what this team is, what we've been working on this year? Maybe Isabella, do you want to go as the team leader?
Sure. So what we're working on is a 130,000 word visual novel with lots of hand-drawn illustrations on the Perry expedition to Japan and its aftermath. And we have been working on this officially since February this year, but the planning started earlier, back in October last year. So we managed to get a lot done in a very short amount of time. And the game is set to be released in 2 weeks.
Fantastic. Okay, so then what's the game called? What's its formal title and where can people find it?
Its formal title is Ghosts Over the Water, Changing the Tides of Japan's Future. And it will be on both itch and Steam.
Okay, awesome. Cool. When it comes out, everyone watching this video will be able to play it. So that's awesome. So let's try to give everybody a sense of who this team is and what backgrounds you all bring to game development. So Ben, what are you studying in school? What year are you? All that stuff.
Hi, so I just graduated from UT Austin. I studied history and government, and I also pursued a certificate in computer science. I had always been interested in video games for basically my entire life, specifically strategy games and things of that sort. So, and furthermore, I had always been interested in blending my aptitude for certain STEM subjects like computer science and math with my interest in the liberal arts. And so when I encountered JapanLab, I mean, I leaped at the opportunity to sort of blend, apply my technical skills, my knowledge of programming in the context of a humanities project fundamentally. And so, yeah, and I'm also headed off to Georgetown Law next fall.
Awesome. Super exciting stuff. All right, Eric, what about you?
Yeah, I'm a rising senior at Yale, and I'm an art major, studying particularly to go into concept art or illustration for game development in particular. So I also might be minoring in Japanese language and I've taken a lot of it. So this was very like unique intersection of those interests for me. And I was very excited to be able to take part in it. As like the art lead, I got to do a lot of really interesting research about historical Japanese clothing and also got to do some blending with my own art style and explore doing like more illustrative styles, because concept art, as I'm doing for my portfolio outside of this project, is a little bit less like aesthetically driven and more about like production and being more like for use for the technical like game pipeline. So it was very enjoyable and I got to get a lot of good practice in. So yeah, very excited to be part of it.
Sweet. Okay, Alexis, you're up next.
All right, so I am a fourth year history major and philosophy minor. Like Ben, I have been interested in video games like since I was a child. And as a history major, I know history can be a lot of hard work and it takes a lot of critical thinking, and sometimes it can get like a little bit tedious. And so I realized that it would be nice if we could blend history and video games together. And so when I was presented with the opportunity to join JapanLab, like Ben, I was really overjoyed at the opportunity. And I've also always been very passionate about writing and character development and like character creation. And so alongside Isabella, who is the other co-writer for this game, I had like a vested interest in really putting a soul back into the intersection between history and gaming, because oftentimes history games turn out to be kind of glorified textbook lessons basically, but in creating this game, we aspire to create something that would be both engaging and educational.
Awesome. Okay, and then that brings us to Isabella.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I'm the narrative co-lead as well as the project manager for this team. And I just graduated from Yale this past May with a degree in history, as well as a certificate in Japanese language. And I have always been interested in historical games. Most of my favorite games from when I was very young were history games, and also a lot of them were Japanese history games. For instance, I was really into like the Samurai Warriors series, which talked about like one particular time period of medieval Japanese history. But I was also very interested in like early modern, late modern Japanese history, which then led me to this project because my advisor at Yale, who is a friend of Dr. Klulo's, they both do research on late modern Japanese history. And when Dr. Klulo said he has the interest of making a video game about Perry expedition, I was immediately drawn to the idea because not only did it align with my interest in history and research about this time period, it also aligns with my passion about video game and interactive narratives, because I have been a creative writer for quite a bit of time, and I have written mostly the traditional creative writing like fiction and some nonfiction as well. And I have published in both genres, but I've never done interactive narrative before. And this is also the first actual novel, if you may call it, that I've done in my entire life. So it's a very exciting opportunity, and that's why I joined the team.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys so much for that. So that's a great introduction to the team. So again, this is Studio Unagi with JapanLab, and the team is being led for everyone else who's watching by Dr. Adam Klulo at UT. And then I'm Haley. I'm the digital humanities specialist helping out with support with helping with learning how to use Unity and basically just supporting the team with everything that they need. But you guys have really built this and learned all these skills pretty much all on your own in a very short period of time. And as we've just heard, half of you are from UT, half of you are from Yale, and all of you are either history or art majors. So the first question I wanted to ask you guys was, what was that like coming to this project with such different academic backgrounds? What are the ways that you had to adjust maybe mentally to learning game development skills? What are the ways that you came towards this project that are different than most of your other coursework?
I guess I can start. By the way, I don't know if I made this clear in my introduction, but I am the lead programmer of the team. So this project, because my aspect was largely technical, I think I will compare my experience with Ghosts Over the Water to my computer science classes and other technical experiences. So in a computer science class, typically you have some kind of project, and the project is very tightly bound by the expectations of the class. Typically the professor has some kind of rubric and they have very clear expectations laid out for you. And furthermore, it's a lot less ambitious. I mean, for example, one time I took a graphics class where the final project was cloning asteroids, the old arcade game. And I mean, Asteroids is not a very complex game. There's really no story. You have a very, very simple goal. And at the end of the day, also you're comparing my work to a pre-existing game. So at the end of the day, it's relatively easy to grade, and I have a pretty clear goal I'm working towards. But with Ghosts Over the Water, it's less obvious. First off, it's a relatively long-term project. I mean, 4 months compared to the couple weeks I spent working on that final project. And so the biggest difference there, just in terms of project thinking, is I had to think about how my actions could reverberate, my technical decisions could reverberate down the future. I mean, when you're working on a 2-week project, you just sort of working towards that end goal. I'm not really putting a lot of thought into my decisions. It's just making the ship move and then making it shoot and whatnot. But when I'm with Ghosts Over the Water, I basically constructed this entire system, and I had to focus very carefully on making sure that I was not creating problems for myself down the line. Because I knew when I started in February, I'm still going to be working on this in May, and I'm still going to be building on this system. But whereas with Asteroids, there is no real convoluted system that I'm having to build on. And so to summarize my answer, I had to perfect that kind of long-term thinking. And I had to focus on making sure that I was not creating problems for myself down the future. So in other words, if I had a problem, I didn't want to just slap a Band-Aid on it. I had to make sure that I could arrive at a solution that would work in the long term.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And then you and Isabella, both as seniors this past year, did historical research, like traditional theses on top of this. Isabella, do you maybe want to talk about the different ways of thinking that maybe, how do I phrase this, like it's very different doing historical research for writing a thesis versus making a video game. So can you try to maybe flesh out some of those different challenges?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that when you asked about the things we have to adjust to. And that was actually the one of the things I feel like I had to adjust to as someone who has been writing historical narratives for forever. And then suddenly switching into like a fictional historical narrative. Because I still remember when we started in February, I was very, very worried about the details. And to the point of like, I remember when Alexis and I were doing research for like a dinner thing, and I had to like look up academic articles to see which food is acceptable to put in the scene. And that sometimes slows down the whole process a little bit. And then also like in terms of like which characters can appear, like which dates this character can be in Edo and which dates he couldn't be seen in Edo and that sort of thing. I was really worried about those in the very beginning, and obviously we want the game to be historical, but I then realized also like with Dr. Clueless help that with a game like this, if we are really going to that degree of like impeccable historical accuracy, then the game itself is going nowhere. And also those details might also distract the player from the actual story of the game. So then I chose to focus more on the story of the game instead of on like those historical details. And I decided like, because if you go down historical rabbit hole, there are so many things that you can find out. But somewhere down the line, if it's enough for the game, then we'll just let the trail of research stop there. Whereas for my thesis, it's quite the opposite, because I definitely want to go down that line and find as much as I can, especially if I am refuting the theories of people who came before me and then pointing out the things that were overlooked. So it's quite a different purpose for this game. And I think because it has a different purpose and the research process also changes, but to the core of it, it's still accurate historical research, and we're still making an accurate historical game. So I think we're still like treating it very seriously, but just in a slightly different way from when you're trying to write a thesis.
Right. Yeah, you guys spent an insane amount of time researching all of this, and the story is massive, and it's just really chock full of this incredible attention to detail. So Alexis, since you worked on the story too, do you want to jump off of that and talk a little bit more about some of the choices that you had to make between like extreme historical detail and then showing off these awesome characters that you made and that you guys really fleshed out?
Yeah, so I'm going to go off of what both Ben and Isabella said. And so in summary, I think the difference between like academic coursework, so to speak, and a more creative project is it's a 3-point thing. I think the first one is teamwork, the second is audience, and the third is process. So when it comes to making a game, the difference between in-game course, I mean, not in-game coursework, academic like coursework and making a game is, whereas in an academic course, you are basically working on a project, to show like your professor, or, in the event that you have to peer review someone else's essay, like that's the only person who will ever see it. But whenever you're on a team, you have to consider, if you did, go down the rabbit hole and you got lost in all these details, it would not be conducive to making like a game, because you didn't really ask like your other teammates like what they thought about it. I think a key thing is communication, because like even if Isabella decided, hey, we could include more historical details here or something, it again, she mentioned that it could really just like slow things down. So you have to check at every level whether it is effective to include something, and that goes to audience, because again, you're not just making this like for a professor or like for a couple classmates. What you end up making is a manifestation of all the decisions that you put into the game. So you have to do quality assurance from basically the bottom to the top. So every time you think about including something new, you really have to see like how do you want, at the base of it, you have to see like, how do you want this character to look? How do you want them to sound or something? Because that is the impression that everyone else is going to get of that character. So you want to strike a balance because you don't want them to be like too boring. At the same time, you don't want them to be like so fantastical that they're suddenly existing like somewhere in the super left field where they're not even historically accurate at all. Because we had ideas for characters that, I mean, our protagonist is fictional, but he's also historically accurate in the sense that his origins and his story are historically believable, but he is fictional in the sense that we like made him ourselves. And that goes for the characters that are based on real historical characters like Shoin and Naosuke and Yoshinobu. They are real, but we also took some liberties without, you know, casting them so far out of this like academic vacuum, so to speak.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that explanation. And so jumping off of that note of where you can take certain liberties, I think that's a great segue into having Eric, you talk about some of your process designing your art, and then also getting back to that question of, as an art student, how is this process so different from your coursework?
Yeah, so as far as like decision making, I think when we do some demos, it'll be easiest to show that. But that definitely was something like, I think that helps me like answer the second question, or like it's the original question, like as far as what's different. For one, my art coursework in general is a little bit more like generalist or fine arts oriented. I think that's just how like Yale, but also just university, like non-art school university art programs tend to be in general anyway. So in that sense, like some of this was like a bit of a relief because it is a little bit more oriented towards the skill set that like specific skill set that I'm going for. But I also think that one like distinction between other work that I've done in the past is even though I've done some work making assets for some games in freelance or in a club that we have in within Yale, this was the time that it was most like story oriented specifically, and the gameplay is basically all just choosing story dialogue options, and that meant that I worked really closely with narrative writers more than I ever had before, because I guess it was sort of a process where we were making characters and also writing them sort of at the same time. And that was an interesting dynamic that sometimes was unfamiliar because I hadn't done anything like it before. And there are certain like times when I was still adjusting to, I can't just make the character look however I want them to look. I have to make sure that it matches how they're being written, but also it was very nice because our game has a lot of characters and it can be kind of hard to like on the spot think of designs for for everybody. Not impossible, and I'm used to doing it, but it was very easy in compared to like in past times when I've had to make like 20 characters and it was just whatever I was thinking of, because I already had like their dialogue. I could look at them and say, this is how they're supposed to act and this is how I want to convey it. So when I demo it, I can go into that a little bit more. But I think like, yeah, as an art student, I'm the only student that's not a history major in our team. And I think as far as that, I do have background in like Japanese language and I've studied Japanese culture before, but it was another thing where I've looked to cultures for inspiration before, but I've never had a project where I had to be like, this is taking place during a very specific time period in Japan. So I can't just like look at Japanese inspired clothing. I have to look at Japanese clothing and do a lot of research and even sometimes translate some articles so that I can figure out exactly like when is it situational and correct for people to be wearing certain things. Because I think clothing ended up being one of the things that we took a little bit more seriously to be truer to history. Yeah, so it was, I think the like summing it up, the main thing for me, like it was very refreshing to have something that's so like applied and like I guess adjusted to my skill set, especially being about Japan. But the most unfamiliar thing, I guess, was working carefully with a team, especially a team of like writers and historians, to try and convey their narrative visually and accurately.
Well, thank you guys. Okay, so right before we get into the demos, I want to do some rapid fire kind of shorter questions. So I'll just have everybody jump in if that's okay. But the first one, just very simply, what for you took the most time? Besides everything.
I guess I'll go first. So to answer simply, the task that took the longest amount of time was actually importing the script into the game, because I had constructed this dialogue system that basically told the game like who says what line, and when they're saying it, like highlight them and make everyone else go gray and that kind of thing. And I had to basically copy and paste the game and then divide it into these text files. And I also had to implement certain commands within those text files, like make the screen go dark here or play a certain song here. And so basically pre-processing the actual script for the game took more took more time than actually like engineering a lot of the systems and whatnot.
Someone else want to hop in? What took the most time for y'all?
For us, it's probably the writing itself. Alexa and I would have those like 6-hour-long narrative sessions like twice a week.
Yep.
And we'll just like sit on our laptops and like hop on the Discord voice channel and then just write together for like 6 hours. And
Yeah, our longest one was like until 3 a.m.
yeah,
right?
sometimes it's like 12 hours. Sometimes it's
Yeah,
like
we pull.
3 a.m. But yeah, we did write like a 130,000 word script in like 3 months, and it took a lot of work. The writing took the most time.
Yeah.
I would say for me, like, I mean, I think this is the case for like all art, but rendering is just the thing that takes a while. It's just a lot of lines and coloring you have to do. But I think that was a little like, it was a bit of a balance to strike because there's a lot of assets we have to make. So it can be very tempting to like try and fix everything or render everything as polished as possible on like the first character. But like I have a deadline. I had to, present the next 10 characters. I don't have like time. So it was polishing takes a while, but it was almost like harder just to get myself not to polish everything as much as I can, like in the beginning until it's more finalized.
Right. Okay, well, on the flip side of this question, what was like the most satisfying? Like, even if it took a ton of time, what's the thing that you were like, oh, thank God we got that done? Like, that was so cool.
This is not like an actual thing that got done, but the word count.
Oh.
Every time we look at the word count, it's so satisfying.
I think for me, it was less like a tangible experience and more so, or it was less so like a tangible moment or thing, and more so just the general experience of booting up the game and seeing everyone's contributions come together, like the background, the script, like the characters' lines, the art. I mean, all of it just at the end, you can just see it, sort of how everyone's contributions have led to just booting up the game and sort of seeing that opening. And it is so satisfying.
I will second that. That was great.
Yeah.
The first time we got to play test things.
Yeah.
I think most satisfying, I guess I would say like, yeah, I mean, I was gonna say seeing the characters that I made be able to like, have like their whole personalities. But I also think I was really satisfied when we picked our art style, and like just being able to see an art style that like I got to create be in the game. I feel like we sort of like checked in pretty regularly and made sure that it was like the right art style for our mission. And I think in general, even though like there's now times that I want to fix things, I've never ended up feeling like I wish I had done a different art style, or I wish I could switch this, just because I feel like we got a pretty confident like I guess backing from our whole team that this was like the right way to communicate both like the stylistic but also historical things that we want to show.
Totally.
Yeah, I'll hop on or piggyback on what both Isabella and Eric said, that a big part of it that was really satisfying for me was just like getting to see like my intuitive vision for what I wanted every character to basically sound and read like. What I found the most satisfying is honestly a tie between seeing everything come together and also seeing the final word count, because Isabella and I, we basically just wrote with like a rolling edits process. And so every time we'd like finish writing a part, I would literally read it over and like edit it, like basically week after week. Not that efficient, but it was because I wanted to make sure everything was perfect. So like getting to write a cohesive and emotionally engaging narrative that kind of underlays like or or basically creates the foundation of the game, and like having like Eric's like incredible art and Ben's amazing programming on top of it, and just again getting to see that all together was like really just fulfilling. It made me feel great.
Yeah. Oh, it was such a cool moment getting to see everything like that, just that first time when we had like an actual file to play. So cool. And every time we get a new release, it's like, oh, everything is different and everything's somehow even better. Okay, so let's transition into the demos. So maybe let's start with Alexis and Isabella. Do you guys want to talk about your process of like, you know, this incredibly long process of doing the narrative, but it all started on a planning page, and then you had to sort of go from there to build this what is now longer than like a typical dissertation. So why don't you walk us through that process?
Okay, so we're doing like this like two-part demonstration thing going on. So this is the very first document that we made for our story ideas. And so this is a random version, like you can see on the side, that this was a living document and we made changes to it, you know, starting in December. And so this basically had like every single note that we were thinking, like, how do we want this scene to go? Because our game is two parts. And so there's like the first part where like you meet everyone, and then the second part where you basically like split off depending on whoever you like ended up aligning with. So we had like rough storyboarding. We had like a name bank. I don't know if it's still here, but we had like a name bank so that we could like name characters, and we wrote like historical notes and everything. It's all very neatly bullet pointed. So this, I think we started officially moving to the script like early February. And so I have the actual document, and this version, which exists in February 27th, is a measly 134 pages. I don't know the word count on it, but this was very early and we've been making edits to it since February. And yeah, like this is how it was at the beginning, basically. And then I think Isabella's going to pull up like the actual final version. But yeah, like right now, I don't think I would be able to even do a word count on this because it would crash my browser. But it's not even done loading. There's like, what, 500 pages on this? But yeah, in the meantime, Isabella, you can talk about the other part of this.
Yeah, should I just screen share, or okay, I'll just share my screen. So as you can see, right now, I'm gonna do a quick word count. There we go. Yeah, this is our current word count. It's 450 pages. So some of the new changes, we have this whole outline with all the chapters. So it's actually like an index of a book. We have our very official like table of contents. We have a game description. We have a guide that we made for the instructors and for the gameplay, which we think is very important since we are an educational game. And this makes a lot of the things about our game and how it should be played clear to teachers who might want to use this game. And then we have this formal table of contents with, you can see like Alexis made lots of our dialogue options here, and like which reputation it increases, which ones it decreases. And yeah, so, and then for the actual script, we made all those poetry screens. This was actually initially Eric's suggestion, I think. So you can see like the entire team's efforts coming together about picking poetry for each chapter, kind of like reflecting the chapter's theme. So we have that, we have all the date screens. And as you can see, like I'm just gonna go to like one of the later scenes. You can kind of see like the differences. It's now color coded. We have full names for the characters, and we have like the choose options page instead of like, it's like in tables. And then we have this little graph that Alexis drew for like, if the choices are consequential or not, and which consequences they lead to. And we have like which characters are present. We have some sprite expressions, which will also appear in the game. And we have the reputation counts. And we have music as well, because we added music to the entire script. And then we have the instructions of like whether we skip to some things. And then there's one other thing that I really want to show, especially considering that people who watch this interview might be educators. So we actually have some educational functions put in into the script. For instance, here, oh, sorry, before this. Yeah, so we actually have a multiple choice quiz time here, where at the end of the part 1, after you meet all the factions, and we understand that for the students, it might be a little difficult to memorize all the factions. And this is just a chance for them to both refresh their memories, as well as to get a clearer sense of which factions they're dealing with, so they can actually responsibly choose which faction to align with at the end of part 1, which will then affect their path for part 2. So as you can see, there's a short 10-question quiz, and this is kind of like a small quiz at the end of a class almost. If you think of part 1 as a class, then at the end of the class, we have a small quiz. And then for the chapters later, we also have all the endings. We have a hidden ending as well. So this hidden ending can only be unlocked when all 3 good endings are achieved. And in the hidden ending, you can see that it's in summer 1903. And for spoiler purposes, I won't share any more of this, but that's pretty much what the script looks like now.
That's so awesome. Thank you guys. And then I think one cool thing to point out is, so in addition to that quiz, where that's kind of the more traditional style of like, oh, we learn information and we'll quiz you and make sure you know. I think another check that this game does really well in keeping it very close to like every decision that you guys made in development was very much towards making it educational. And I think that idea of extreme attention to detail that you guys were talking about earlier, as with like writing the script and making the art, it's like if players pay really close attention to the history and they learn it as they play, they'll do better in the game and they get like higher reputation with each faction and they're more likely to unlock the good endings. So yeah, all of the choices that you guys made relating to how this game will use in the classroom was really impressive over time. And before we jump to another demo of a different part of the game, I did want to ask the story team specifically, but also the team as a whole, what it was like. So we had Clay Carmouche from Xbox come and visit and work with the story team a little bit a couple months ago, and that was a really cool experience. So can you guys talk a little bit about how that affected your writing of the story, or what you learned from that experience?
Should I go maybe? Okay, so I think the thing that Clay helped the most was actually not the details of the script, but rather the main direction of the script, especially part 2, because by the time we met with him, we had a pretty clear sense of what part 1 was going to be from the very beginning, and we talked about it with Dr. Glow many times. But for part 2, back then it was very open-ended, and we have a vague sense of like how this should go, because there's the huge lore of history behind all of this, and we know where each character was going to go in actual history. But we were really thinking about like what moments are the dramatic moments that we can really bring out to portray the path that they went down. And during our workshops with Clay, we actually talked about all those possibilities and brainstormed ideas for like which moments to pick, which conflicts to emphasize, and which characters to bring out. Because one thing that we were having trouble with, for instance, was we didn't have enough diverse characters. So that means like female characters, that means characters not from the samurai class, and we didn't want this to be a very monotonous experience for the players. So then when we brainstormed it with Clay, for instance, we came up with the idea of portraying Yoshinobu, one of our main characters' wives, and how his wedding to her kind of portrayed the underlying greater idea of a certain tension between 2 different political factions at the time in Japan. And then we ended up making her a character. Now she has her own story, she has her own art, thanks to the beautiful art of Eric. And yeah, everything is coming together. And just like that, we also picked the direction for a few other scenes. And something we had back then was that we had like endings ready. In fact, we have all the endings ready. And part 2 was this very important section that connects the decision that the player made at the end of part 1 and the endings that the player eventually faces. So with Clay's help, we were able to really fill in that part and make it a very dynamic part for the players to immerse themselves into. And really like build up their emotions and feel resonated enough with the main characters. So when the endings actually happen, they can feel related enough to the characters to feel the same emotions that the characters are going through.
That's awesome. Cool. So maybe Eric, do you want to move on and show some of your art? Because I think that that jumps off really nicely at that, helping the players connect emotionally to the story, because I feel like your art does that really effectively.
Thank you. Yeah, I can demo for sure. Let me share my screen. Okay, so these are a few of the characters from the game. Our game has a lot of characters, and the visual novel like format in general is very character driven. So we're getting players invested in the characters, and the reason people will keep playing is because they're interested in the characters and their relationships with each other. So it's really important for characters to be recognizable and memorable, and especially for our game because it's historical, and a lot of these characters are pretty much all of them are real people that are important for Japanese history as well as for our narrative. We made it with like this nuance, I guess, nuance focus, I guess, like we were trying to represent like nuance and history accurately, you know. So yeah, Isabella and Alexis talked about this a bit, but we do have to keep in mind both adhering to history, but also adding our fair amount of our own style and imagined personalities for these characters, just so the overall feel will be of a game rather than of a textbook made into a game, you know. And an important part of the artistic process was striking this balance, where we're communicating the historical nature of the game, but also giving some expectation that you'll require some suspension of disbelief, which is why we chose a more like stylized, I guess, art style in general. So one thing of note you can see with these 5 that I chose to bring is their clothing tends to be a bit more on like the subdued or historically accurate side, more true to history, and something that I gathered a lot of references for a lot of these characters, looking at clothing that they wore historically and also just generally clothing that was popular in the time for people of their social standing. But then if we draw everyone with clothing like that, then if everyone else their faces were drawn in a more true to life style, things like their eye color, their eye shape, their hair color, and their hairstyles, things like hairstyles have a lot of meaning to people from that time, but we're not familiar with their hairstyles. You know, the average player wouldn't be. So the amount of characters would end up being hard to keep track of, I think. Especially with the amount there are, and especially for people that aren't that experienced with Japanese language, because it can be difficult to remember names in language that you don't speak. And these are like older Japanese names. So one of our main characters, his name is 9 syllables long. So if you're not used to remembering Japanese names, then that could be quite difficult. And it's really important that people get comfortable with looking at these characters and remember them, because again, so much of like the gameplay and what makes this game exciting is getting to know them and getting emotionally invested in them and their stories, right? So we decided that it made sense that since clothes are like chosen by the person that's wearing them, they're indicative of rank and give a lot of sense of the time period, that they should stay closer towards like reality. Whereas things like the faces and the hairstyles and colors could be stylized more heavily so that their appearances will be like as eye-catching, as memorable as they possibly can be, which we also got good feedback from playtesters regarding that. Some people I know have like called characters like, oh, I remember him because he has pink hair, or I remember him because of the things like the, you know, his eye color, things like that. And in addition, anime slash manga style, I guess, they're very standard for visual novels too, and popular with the audience of people that play those games, and also just a trendy art style in general. So because we're marketing this towards people who are trying to get into Japanese history or maybe aren't as experienced with it, we wanted to come across like an actual game, and picking a trendy art style that will grab their attention is also, this is a good way of doing that. So I have a couple characters in particular that I want to demo today. I'll reference some others along the way, but yeah, I'll get into their design process. So the first one is Naoharu, who's our main character, or I guess our player character. And out of the main characters, he's the only one that's fully fictional. He began as an art demo that I presented to our team when I was just trying to give them a sense of what I was thinking. Obviously a much more crude version, it didn't have any rendering. and the clothing and hair was more basic. But we ended up going back to him and choosing him as our player character for a few particular reasons. One was him looking quite like youthful and like kind of like a nice person, I guess. And it gives like this impression of sort of like a blank canvas that the player can project themselves onto. Just also showing that, you know, the events of the game are gonna sort of shape how his life goes. And so making him look sort of like innocent or inexperienced was something that we all sort of resonated with, as far as like when you first see him, you get the sense that he's like sort of like wide-eyed, both like in terms of like metaphorically, but also literally. And he also has a more neutral color palette and the most true to life hair color of any of the characters in the game, which again gives sort of this blank canvas experience when people are looking at him. And in contrast, there are these two characters I wanted to show. Oh, wait. Yeah, there we go. Abe Masahiro and Sakamoto Ryoma. These are actual characters. These are designs that I made for them. But they contrast a lot with Naoharu's, especially color palette wise. These characters give you very immediate reads about how they are just from looking at them. So for example, Masahiro is supposed to be like, and I'll get back into this later, but he's a more like grounded character and like calmer character. So blue will sort of convey that, whereas Ryoma is this more like fiery, like young character, does a lot of very daring things, and this sort of like red and orange, like one of the most like stimulating colors that we can possibly use. So that was a priority. And whereas like someone like our main character, there isn't necessarily like all these like sort of loaded color and visual language. So again, people can hopefully project themselves onto him a little bit more easily. A couple of things that were added after my initial art demo were, number one is the headband that he's wearing. No other character has a headband like this. And I added it sort of quietly. I didn't really ask everyone about it, but the main reason is just because it really helps with, given that he's our player character, we see him in a lot of different scenarios during his lifetime. I'm not going to, they're zoomed in so I don't show spoilers, but see him doing a lot of different poses, you know, different things happening to him. So giving him a headband, especially one that like is a lot brighter than his hair, will help mark that it's always him, and people can always look for the red headband and say, I know who that is, and figure like help them orient themselves within any scenes. And then also this jacket that he's wearing called kataginu is an indicator for a samurai class, and just something that I added with more historical accuracy, I guess, communicate where his standing is in life, and yeah, and also just generally like link him more to the time period that he comes from. And the second character I want to show is Inaosuke, who is one of our three main characters who has a dedicated story route. And when we were first like explaining the art style, I used him like to some of the people involved in the project. I used him as a good example. So he's similar to Naoharu. He has samurai clothing, but he has a bit more of a distinct color scheme for his character, and he also has family crests on his clothing. I think Naosuke is interesting, like in his position as a character, because he has his own like mainline story, and the emotional climaxes of that story are very dependent on us as the player getting to know him and getting to like him. But in both of the other routes, he's very much an antagonistic character, and I believe in both, like he's kind of framed as like unforgivably cruel, and the other main characters in our game really hate him. And it was a little bit of a difficult balance as a character designer. I've never had something like that where I had to make a character that was supposed to be both like sympathetic and very sympathetic in some instances, but also like basically the villain in certain other parts of the game. And so I had to sort of like try and figure out how to tackle that. I wanted him to look kind of intimidating, so that if you only interact with him in part one, and you don't end up playing his route, or you don't play his route first, you could see him as like this sort of like villainous character. But I also didn't want him to make him look evil, because if players don't like him, then they might try to avoid the route. Or, you know, I guess slightly better case scenario, if they don't avoid his route, they might just not really feel like they can connect with him properly, and that could take a lot of the emotional impact out of the scenes that Isabella and Alexis wrote. So I owed it to them to make him look adaptable for both of those instances. And there's a few ways I tried to make him look intimidating but not evil. The first one was adding armor. Other characters don't really have anything like that mostly. And it sort of marks him as a warrior type character. He has shoulder armor, which a lot of game designers like to use because it makes their shoulders look more like exaggerated and makes their shoulders look bigger and more imposing. Yeah, we don't really see him in battle or any of the characters in battle really, but the armor is suggesting he has a lot of like strength, but also suggesting his like military and political strength too. He has a lot of backing, so he's supposed to look like a very like capable, stable character. And then the scar on his eye is adding to this because lots of samurai in that period, this is like toward the end of the age where samurai were really prominent. So a lot of them still had their military gear, things like swords, but weren't actually fighting with them. And I wanted to convey he actually has like seen things in his life and he has more wisdom and experience. So that was part of why I added it. And also Scar is just a visual shorthand for a tough character, which based on the early script that I was working off of when I first designed him, that was the atmosphere he was like communicating to me. And then another way of showing intimidation that I used, or I guess, you know, communicating character in general that I use designing pretty much everyone for this game is through shape language. So Naosuke has, I would say probably the most angular, one of the, at least most angular shape language of all the characters. His hair falls into very like sharp spikes and he has the most angular eyes. He has angular eyebrows, his like sort of sharp scar. And I even gave him like an angular collar that nobody else has. All of those things are sort of lending themselves towards, giving this more like intimidating or like in some cases villainous, villainous appearance. And you can contrast that with the characters I showed from before, where Abe Masahiro, like for example, in his hat and in his like the line of the collar of his shirt is more like square and some round shape language too. And those things tend to communicate things more like him being reliable or calculating. Those are things that are very central to Masahiro's character in general. And also it worked out because that's a kind of clothing that he would actually be wearing. But I try to give his character more, you know, stable shape language. And then Ryoma has some spiky and some round shape language because he is like very fiery and bright, but he's also quite youthful. So mixing both of those together would help to communicate that. Whereas, Naosuke is much more angular, and that was a very important thing. And you can see this even more clearly with some of our female characters. Obviously, female characters in general tend to be more round, just as far as anatomy goes, like with their head and things like an anime style. But it's not always created equal. It's easy to visualize with Mikako and Fumi, whereas Miyako's role in the story is a bit more, not threatening, but she's a little bit less sympathetic, whereas Fumi comes off very like sweet and innocent, and I wanted the character designs to reflect that. So Mikako's design in general has a lot more angles. Her hair is more angular, her eyes are more angular, and it gives her more like stern and serious expression, whereas Fumi just looks very sweet. So that's a quick summary of the character designs. But yeah, I think going back to what I said earlier with what was new with the project, I also really enjoyed like the early sketching process. I got to bring, hang on, I have some of this too, I think. Yeah. I got to like, during this like design process, I got to like have a lot of fun with like, I would look at the characters and the script and how they're coming along, and I would bring some sketches to our team meetings and we could go over them together and figure out like which ones matches the character best, which ones do we think like don't really match the game, and which ones can we like save and use for other characters. And that's a really important process of like game development pipeline in general and in the actual industry. And I had always really wanted to work with a team specifically to have that experience of working with people that are not artists and figuring out like what can really work and communicate the vision that we want. So I was very grateful for that. And then, overall, I think I was just very excited to be able to develop a solid visual direction for our game. Because yeah, it was a bit of a tough ask to make something both trendy and historical. But I think like it might lean a bit too stylized for some people or too historical for other people, but I think it strikes overall a good balance, and giving like an expectation of historical accuracy from the clothing, but also expectation that you need some suspensions of disbelief, because it's in like not like perfect true to history, true to textbook sort of art style. And I think it, yeah, it does a good job of communicating both of those things. And I'm thankful to Clay for his encouragement about that, and also for my team members for being really willing and enthusiastic about incorporating my vision. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. That was so cool. So we've heard a lot about the things that you're reading, the things that you're seeing, like the player's experience of the game, but there's an incredible amount of work that happens on the back end, putting all of this stuff together so that people can actually have that experience of playing through it. So Ben, why don't you talk a little bit about how you made that all happen?
Okay, so first I would like to explain what I am going to show and why I picked that. So I thought about trying to demo sort of the wider back end of the dialogue system and sort of like trying to explain how it works. But it's very convoluted and it would probably just look confusing and would probably not be that constructive of a demo. So instead, I think I'm going to show a feature that actually ties into the theme of this conversation about education and the primacy of education to this game. So you encounter a lot of Japanese vocabulary words that the average layperson probably won't know. And so we decided to implement this glossary system that would highlight certain words and define them so that so that players could follow certain conversations utilizing historical Japanese terminology. So I'm going to show off basically this little dialogue system, or this little glossary system I have made, and explain how it works. So I'm going to share my screen and start up the game. So very quickly, we're going to encounter some historical words, which is why we can start from the beginning. Got to give it a second to boot up. And also I figured it would be nice to just sort of show off during this interview how like the introduction to our game and sort of just basically how it looks. You will see that the console is going crazy. Feel free to ignore that. So we're gonna start a new game. And here you can see that we have these poetry screens that have been referenced earlier and these date screens. And we're gonna click through a little bit, but while we're doing that, you can see that we have this little glossary button. And there are 5 default words that will always be available. And as you move on and you encounter more historical terminology, the game will add these to the glossary. So we just got to click a little more before we encounter our first group of historical terms. So it's going to be right here. So we have a nightmare scene, and you can see that we have a new word in our glossary, chief senior counselor. Lord Abe Masahiro, the chief senior counselor of Japan. And then he says another word, he references shogi. So if we go to our glossary, you can see that they are here, whereas they weren't previously. And we can click on them to receive a definition. And that is going to continue to happen throughout the game. And also you can't hear that. I don't think you can hear in-game sounds, but there's a little bell that plays upon that little notification. So now that you've seen it, I'm going to show a little bit how it works on the back end. So I have this convoluted web of scripts, which is going to take a while to explain. Actually, I mean, for the sake of simplicity, we'll just sort of overlook that for now. And we're going to focus on 2 main scripts, this text handler script that sort of handles the dialogue system, and this UI helper script. So basically, I have written this script, which will toggle that little dialogue screen you saw. Sorry, that little glossary screen you saw. If it's toggled, it sets it to this G panel, glossary panel. It sets it, Sorry, 1 second. It's always a little confusing looking at your own code. So yes, that's right. If it is so if it's toggled, when you click it, it disables it. But if it's not active, it sets it to be active. And it also pauses the game, which is what these do right here. Sort of the meat of the script is this little loop right here, which basically all of the buttons you saw are actually active at the default. And there are little tags associated with them. They're called player preferences in Unity. And basically that tag is either a 0 or a 1. A 0 means you have not encountered it. A 1 means you have encountered it. If it is 0, meaning you have not encountered it, Unity will disable that button. But if you have encountered it, Unity will enable it, which is basically what these lines do right here. And in order to actually enable that or disable it, sorry, in order for Unity to register that you've encountered it, we go to this little snippet of code contained within the dialog system script. That basically we have our array of vocabulary words, which was handed to me by the story team. And basically, this is contained within the script, which is actually going through each line in the script. So you can see that we have out of the lines in the script, and if the current line contains the word, it's going to trigger this bit right here. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to show that a little alert using something called a coroutine, which is basically just another thread of code, or a sort of a parallel thread that runs independently but parallel to the main line of code. I'm trying to keep this relatively jargon free. So basically what it's going to do is you can see if it encounters it and the flag is 0, it's going to set it to 1. And then we're going to cut down to this coroutine. Basically what it does is it triggers the alert, plays the bell sound. The bell sound is attached to it using something called an audio source. And then it is going to populate the text in that little glossary alert, telling us that there is a new word in the glossary, and it's going to inform us what that word is. It's going to wait 5 seconds, and then it's going to make the little alert disappear. So let's go back up to it. And that is essentially how the glossary works. I don't think I'm forgetting anything. Of course, oh, you can see right here that just to sort of explain what this is, this VIDX, basically the first 5 words will always be available, but then the ones after that aren't. And so basically what it's doing here is it's just iterating through, basically for each word. It increments by 1 and then checks the tag associated with each word. So basically each word has an ID. Chief Senior Counselor is 6, Shogi is 7, Daimyo is 8, and so forth. And it is basically just checking the flag associated with that word. Apologize, I hope this might seem a little scatterbrained.
No, this is great. I think the important thing for the viewers who are watching this to take away from this is how much is involved with something that seems very simple to the game. Like just something as simple as pointing out, hey, this is a term that you might not know, let us help you out. Like you're operating what, like at least 2 different scripts here, in addition to all of the work you had to do actually in Unity to make this happen. So there's a lot of moving parts to this.
Yeah, but that's so that's kind of this specific feature in a nutshell. And like I said, I chose to demonstrate this because 1, it fits into this theme of education, and also it's a lot simpler compared to sort of the other much more involved scripts. But yeah, that's kind of my bit. And thank you for listening.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for demoing all of that. I think like it's just so cool to hear you guys talk about your process of how you made all this happen. And one thing that I wanted to point out to make sure that everyone who's watching this is kind of like this point hits home is that you guys have all had very little experience with game development before this project, if any, and none of you have worked in Unity before. So like the amount of stuff that you guys have learned and the amount of different disciplines that you guys are operating in addition to the things you're actively learning in school, which is history and art and philosophy and other minors that you guys may have taken on. Like this is a tremendous amount of work, both learning the skills you need to do this and then putting it all together and then doing that as a team where teams can be really difficult to work in sometimes. So I just wanted to point out to everyone listening the tremendous feat that you guys have done, and especially that you've only done it in such a short period of time. Like we started working on this and mostly just ideating on it like this fall, and then we started really hardcore working on it this spring, and it's really all come together. So awesome. This has been so cool. So I just have one more question for you guys. With all of this being said, with all the things you've had to learn, with all the work that's gone into it and all the challenges you've had to face, what is some general advice that you have for the next JapanLab team? Because we're going to continue in the coming semesters having more teams make more video games. So what do you hope that they learn from what you guys have done?
Sorry, Ben, I saw you unmute for a second.
Oh, it's all right. Go ahead.
Okay. My main advice is, this is going to sound really contradictory, but hold your vision, but also be open to making mistakes and revising plans like as they come, because we had a lot of great ideas that we ended up having to scrap, or we had to go through processes of revision because some things just didn't turn out the way we wanted them to, or we just ended up running into things. And like you just have to not really, take it seriously, but like don't sacrifice quality for trying to make everything just absolutely perfect and you're like just on that grind like 24/7. Like once you take the soul out of a project, it ceases being like a project and it just becomes a task. So it's like if you can find ways to make the process like engaging without being like a brain drain, and just also just being like as low stress as possible. Okay, game design is hard, it's tedious, as Haley just said, like it is a lot of work, but if you just burn out like super quickly, you're going to hate it. And like maybe you do end up finding out that game design or making like a digital media project just like isn't for you, then that's fine. But also like as you're doing the process, I would just say like not to make it more difficult than it has to be. Like always be open to, just if you want help from your other team members, I'd say go for it. Just ask your supervisors, ask like your I guess if your supervisor is also like a previous professor, like that's what happened for me with Dr. Kulo, because I took a class with him. Like just be open to like asking for advice. And yeah. And also, this is off topic, but Haley, thank you for your help. Like I know you just spent all that time like applauding like us, but also thank you. Your advice and your contributions were super helpful. And yeah, thank you.
That's so sweet. Thank you. Honestly, I was so surprised. Okay, so for everyone listening who doesn't know, my role for this team was supposed to be, I created an educational video game as my thesis when I graduated from UT, and I was brought on to help new students learn game development skills. And I did all of no teaching for this. You guys really like learned a lot of the stuff yourself. So it was really, excuse me, it was really crazy for me to see how much that you guys wanted to be independent and learn all this stuff on your own. I thought it was so cool, but it was so nice also just to be able to, when you guys did have questions, to be able to answer them and to help you out, but also just to kind of be here to cheerlead you guys. So yeah, so as Alexis said, for the next team, it'll be Dr. Kulo and myself, and then I think a couple of you guys are going to come back and help a little bit. So for the next team, always ask questions. This is a very supportive environment, and it's designed so that you can feel free to make mistakes and learn and try new things and not make a video game necessarily that is longer than a dissertation. This is a very unique experience.
I guess I'll just butt in and offer my word of advice. So this this is kind of for like any future programmers or tech people, but also it's really just a word of advice that applies to everyone in every discipline. Project management and planning is so, so, so important. In the earlier stages of this project, I operated on a very ad hoc basis where I was sort of putting band-aids on things, and I wasn't really thinking long term, because it's very intimidating and very hard, and it's tempting when you encounter a problem or a bug to look for some quick fix. Don't do that. You will regret it down the line, because I mean, I would try to go for like the quick fix. I would avoid sort of I would avoid the process of sitting down and thinking through it carefully and then arriving at a solution that would ultimately result in a better functioning game. And I'm sort of embarrassed to admit that, but like, you know, the short term, like easy fix is just very seductive, but almost every single time I would have to scrap that short term solution later down the line. So I really wasn't saving myself. I was just creating more work for myself in the long term. Point being, you just do not slap a band-aid on your work. And if you encounter a problem, give it its due diligence and think about a long-term solution that is ultimately going to complement your future efforts, and your future self will thank you. And so, like I said, I learned this in the specific context of programming, but it's just a general point about the importance of project management and long-term structured thinking.
And I guess I'll chime in as well, because I've been talking mostly about my role as the narrative lead, but not as a project manager. Definitely for future teams, make sure you give yourself lots of time. That's one thing that we learned from the previous team about like but also because it was during 2020, so they had many emergencies that had to slow down their entire creative process a lot. So for this one, we actually set the insane deadline of a minimal viable product for part one, like basically a month down the line of us starting the project. And it was a very crazy deadline, and we knew what we signed ourselves up for, but eventually, because we were able to get that much done in the first month, later down the line, when lots of things happened, basically like each one of us caught COVID at some point in this past semester. And then we also had other things that we could not foresee that made our process slower. But because we left ourselves enough time for this, we were still able to like ship the game. And also because initially we set the deadline to be the end of May, which was when all of our classes end. And it turned out we turned out like needing another month for actually finishing up the game, and another half a month for like polishing it and finalizing the assets. So even with that, we're still like going beyond our initial timeline a little bit. But I do have to admit that our initial timeline was a little crazy. But without that crazy initial deadline, we won't be able to be where we are at this point. So don't be afraid to set impossible deadlines, because they will be possible and you will have something by that deadline. And also make sure if you do sign yourself up for the team, make sure you are prepared to put in lots of your time and effort to make the game. I mean, like how much effort you put into the game is really up to you, but really think about what you want the game to be. And it's your own game, so be proud of it.
Yeah, I think my advice is very specific to artists, but sort of like Ben's, I think there are some things that work for everybody. Yeah, I think for artists in particular, I think the first most important thing is getting visual direction and making sure your team is happy with it. I'm assuming most people, like future teams, won't have done a lot of like, game concept work or work for production in general, because most college students are not industry professionals. So if that's not something that you have experience with, I think like it's very important to get used to communicating with your team about it, and making sure that it is really working. And I think an important part of that sort of like lends itself to just the way that doing work will go in general in these kinds of things. Ours is, I was like the main art director for a lot of like character design and backgrounds and things. And if you've only ever drawn illustrations on your own, you can go at your own pace. And most importantly, you're not balancing a lot of things at once. So you can finish things and polish them whenever you want. And that's something I really, really encourage future artists to be cognizant of being used to that, because normally like in a production environment, you don't want to like make one background for our visual novel or one character, make it super detailed, super polished before you start anything else, because you're going to need to make other characters. And not only will you have used up a lot of your initial time just making one, but also you're holding all of your other characters to that same standard, which can create problems for you later and can make your crunch times a lot worse versus progressing them all more similarly and then expanding or contracting how much work you do based on how much time that you have. And I think an important part of that, especially as art people, art takes a long time. And when you're working with people that aren't artists, it can be hard to communicate how much time things are going to take you. And I am very lucky to have been in a team that's very understanding about those things. But so I had like some wiggle room to figure out exactly how I was going to communicate and how long things were going to take. But I obviously don't know the future teams. So that's one thing, is like, make sure you're advocating for yourself and making sure that you're thinking about, you know, on your own, how much time things are going to take and planning that out. Being as organized as you can about it you'll really thank yourself later when, you know, like right now I'm swimming in CGs I have to make, but I've planned them out. So, and I've gotten like a good rhythm for it. So yeah, I think and sort of like what Alexis said, if you lean into things that you like to draw, and you're forthcoming about that at the beginning and set that expectation, you can make it something that you'll really enjoy. And I really enjoyed it. But yeah, just be careful, make sure you communicate, make sure your direction fits something that you're comfortable with, and you'll really enjoy it instead of like feeling burnt out or feeling really put upon by it. Like Isabella said, your game is, you're going to get out of your game what you put into it. So making it something that you're excited to put a lot of work into will make your product much, much better.
Wouldn't be a Zoom call if someone forgot to unmute themselves. Yeah, thank you guys so much for this interview. I feel like this was such a rich discussion. And I hope everyone who gets to watch this really gets to appreciate how much work and care and thought that you guys put into this game, because it's really spectacular. So just to wrap up quickly, and then I'll stop the record button. This has been Studio Unagi working with JapanLab, and this game is going to be available on Steam and itch.io very soon. So by the time you see this video, it very likely will be a completed game and ready for you to play it. So go check it out.